Well, life has a way of humbling us in the most unexpected moments. Sometimes it takes a single experience to remind us that no matter how far we've come, no matter how much we've achieved, there's always another lesson waiting to be learned, another glimpse of God's grace shining through the ordinary. I remember one day, years ago, when I thought I had seen it all. I'd been through challenges, celebrated victories, faced disappointments, and tasted success. But on an ordinary afternoon somewhere between Los Angeles and New York, God would use a simple airplane seat to remind me of something far greater than business, fame, or status. He would remind me about humility, dignity, and the power of treating others with respect. That morning I was flying out for a meeting, dressed like I always do, nothing fancy, just jeans, an old shirt, a jacket I'd had for years. No one on that flight knew who I was or what I did. And that was exactly how I wanted it. See, when you've been blessed in life, you don't need to announce it. You don't need to wear your success like a crown. You just live it quietly, letting your character do the talking. But as I boarded that plane, I noticed a man sitting in my seat, expensive suit, shiny watch, the kind of look that said, "I'm important." I walked up to him gently and said, "Excuse me, sir. I believe that's my seat." He didn't even look up, just kept typing. So I spoke again, a little louder this time, and when he finally did glance at me, his eyes were cold and dismissive. "The seat's taken," he said. "Friends, I've learned that life will always test your patience before it blesses your path." In that moment I could have lost my temper, could have thrown around my name or my title, but I felt a peace inside me saying, "Stay calm. This isn't about a seat, it's about something deeper." The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, stepped in and handled the situation with such grace. When she asked the man for his ticket, he waved her off, saying, "Do you know who I am? Isn't that something?" How often do people measure their worth by their title or their bank account instead of their heart? Eventually, the captain came out, firm but fair, and the man had no choice but to move. And as I sat in that seat, I felt a quiet assurance that God was doing something behind the scenes. Sometimes He lets us walk through awkward, uncomfortable moments to prepare the stage for something meaningful later. When we landed in New York, I asked the crew to have that man meet me in the executive lounge. He came in with confidence, ready to complain, ready to make demands. But when he saw me sitting there, when he realized I owned the very airline he had been threatening, his face changed. And in that still moment, I told him the truth, not to embarrass him, but to help him see. "You called me old man," I said. "You told me to move to the back of the plane. But you forgot that respect isn't earned by power, it's given by grace." I didn't punish him. Instead, I gave him a second chance, because that's what God does for all of us. He shows us who we are, not to shame us, but to shape us into who we're meant to be. Months later, that same man wrote letters of apology, not just to me, but to every person he had hurt. He said that day changed his life, and I believe it did. Friends, every encounter, every delay, every insult, every test is a setup for transformation. Don't let pride rob you of perspective. The measure of your life isn't in what you own, but in how you treat others when nobody's watching. Remember, when you walk humbly, when you lead with kindness, and when you treat people with dignity, you don't just honor them, you honor God. 3 years ago, I was flying from Los Angeles to New York for what seemed like just another business trip. I'd made that flight dozens of times before, but little did I know God was about to remind me of something far more valuable than any meeting or deal. You see, I've spent a lifetime in business, investing in people, in dreams, in ideas. One of those investments was in SkyWest Airlines, a company I believed could show the world that excellence and kindness don't have to be separate. I made it my mission that every person who boarded one of our planes would feel valued, respected, and seen. Because to me, success isn't about building companies, it's about building character. And yet, even when you believe in humility, life will always test your heart to see if you're really living it. That morning I woke early, put on my old jeans, a soft shirt, and my worn leather boots. Nothing flashy, I've never believed in making an entrance. My mother used to tell me, "Son, let your actions speak so loud that you never need to raise your voice." So I walked through that airport like any other traveler, just another face in the crowd. No assistance, no red carpet, no one calling my name. I like it that way. When you've been blessed, you don't need to announce it, you just need to walk in gratitude. As I sipped my coffee and waited for boarding, I felt that calm sense of purpose that comes when you know who you are in God's eyes, not because of wealth or position, but because of peace. When they called for first class, I picked up my old leather bag and made my way to the gate. I had my favorite window seat reserved, seat 2A, the same one I always chose when I wanted to read, reflect, or simply look out at the clouds and thank God for another day. You see, it doesn't matter how high you climb in life, when you stay grounded in humility, you'll never forget where your blessings come from. That's why I never traveled to be noticed, I traveled to stay thankful. On that flight, as I walked down the aisle smiling at the crew, I felt a deep appreciation for every person who makes the journey possible, the pilot, the attendants, the workers no one sees. Because the truth is, leadership isn't about sitting in the best seat. It's about remembering those who make the journey smoother for everyone else. I've learned that dignity isn't tied to your title, and respect isn't reserved for the powerful. It's the everyday kindness, the quiet grace, the gentle smile, that's what defines who we really are. And I believe that when you choose to live that way, God places you exactly where you need to be, not just in business class, but in the classroom of life, where every encounter becomes another chance to live out the values that truly matter. That morning, I arrived early at LAX, just as I always do. I've learned over the years that showing up early isn't just about catching a flight, it's about living with intention, being prepared, and respecting the journey. I was dressed simply: jeans, a comfortable shirt, an old jacket, and my favorite pair of weathered boots that had walked through more stories than I could count. Nothing about me said celebrity or business owner, and that's just how I liked it. I didn't need anyone to recognize me, I just wanted to travel like everyone else. One passenger among many, grateful for the opportunity to see another sunrise and experience another day of God's grace. The morning was peaceful, security was smooth, the airport hummed familiar, the smell of coffee filling the air like a quiet blessing. I grabbed a cup, found a corner seat, and just sat for a few moments watching people rush by, families heading on vacation, business travelers glued to their phones, children wide-eyed with excitement. It struck me then, as it often does, that every person in that terminal carried a story, a purpose, a reason for being there. Some were chasing dreams, others escaping pain, but all of them mattered. That's something I've carried with me my whole life. Everyone has value, and you never know when a small act of respect can become someone else's turning point. When the announcement came for first-class boarding, I quietly gathered my things, my laptop, my documents, my worn leather bag, and walked down the jetway. I wasn't thinking about business deals or meetings. I was thinking about how blessed I was to live this life, to still have opportunities to grow, to learn, to give. You see, when you approach life with gratitude instead of entitlement, every ordinary moment becomes extraordinary. I stepped onto the plane and greeted the flight attendants with a smile. They were young, cheerful, doing their best to manage a crowd of passengers, all with their own agendas. I know that work can be thankless sometimes, but I've always believed that kindness costs nothing and pays great dividends. As I found my row seat 2A, my favorite window seat, I felt that quiet joy of routine, that sense of peace that comes from knowing exactly where you're supposed to be. I planned to spend the flight reviewing notes, maybe reading a few chapters, maybe even catching a nap. I didn't expect drama or disruption. I just wanted a few hours of calm above the clouds. But life has a way of surprising us right when we get comfortable. Sometimes God sets the stage not for our convenience but for our growth. That day, I didn't know it yet, but that seat, simple, familiar, assigned weeks earlier, was about to become the setting for a powerful lesson in patience, humility, and grace. Because when we think we're just boarding a flight, God may be boarding us into a moment that will change our hearts forever. As I stepped onto that plane, friends, I noticed something right away. You ever have one of those moments where your spirit just feels something before your mind catches up? That's what happened. There he was, a man dressed to impress, the picture of success. His suit looked like it had been stitched by angels in Italy, his shoes polished so bright you could see your reflection in them, and on his wrist, a watch that sparkled like it was auditioning for its own commercial. But more than what he wore, it was the way he carried himself. Shoulders back, chin high, moving like the world owed him something. You could almost feel the air of arrogance surrounding him. And there he sat in my seat, seat 2A, my window seat. The one I'd chosen weeks earlier. He was typing furiously on his laptop, completely lost in his world, as if no one else on that plane existed. Now, I've learned in life that moments like this aren't accidents, they're appointments. God doesn't put us in these situations just to test our patience. He uses them to reveal our character. I walked over calmly and said, "Excuse me, sir, I believe you're in my seat." He didn't even glance up, not a word, not a nod, just kept typing. I waited, smiled, and tried again, a little louder this time. "Sir, that's my seat 2A. And that's when he finally looked up. Friends, if looks could speak, his would have said, "You're not worth my time." He gave me a quick glance, looked me up and down my old boots, my worn jacket, and decided in that moment that I didn't matter. Then he said 3 words I'll never forget. "The seat's taken." No apology, no respect, just entitlement wrapped in designer fabric. And I'll be honest, for a split second, something inside me stirred. Not anger, but disappointment. Because here was a man who had probably worked hard to get where he was, who had every outward sign of success, yet he'd forgotten the simplest truth that greatness without grace is just pride in disguise. I stood there quietly, praying under my breath, "Lord, help me show this man something more than frustration. Help me show him dignity, because you never know who's watching. You never know what kind of seed your reaction might plant." That day, I wasn't just standing in an airplane aisle. I was standing in a moment designed by God to remind me that respect isn't about who you are in the world's eyes. It's about who you choose to be when no one else seems to care. And as I looked at that man sitting in my seat, I realized this wasn't about travel or comfort. It was about character. And God was about to use that moment to teach both of us something we would never forget. When I finally spoke to the man in my seat, I did what I've always tried to do, start with kindness. "Excuse me, sir," I said softly. "I believe you're in my seat." He didn't even look up, just kept typing, fingers flying across that laptop as if the whole world revolved around whatever was on his screen. I waited a moment, thinking maybe he didn't hear me, and tried again, a little louder this time. "Sir, that's seat 2A. I think there may have been a mix-up." This time he looked up, and the look he gave me I'll never forget. It was the kind of look that sizes you up in an instant and decides you're not worth much. His eyes went from my weathered face to my simple jacket and back again. Then, with a sigh full of arrogance, he said, "The seat's taken." No apology, no courtesy, just a wall of entitlement. I could have let that sting. I could have snapped back, raised my voice, demanded respect. But friends, I've learned that when life gives you moments like that, you have 2 choices. You can react in pride or you can respond with grace. So I smiled gently and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but that's my assigned seat." That's when he looked at me again, smirked, and said, "Look, old man, I've got important work to do. I need the window seat for my presentation. Why don't you move to the back?" The words hit like a slap, but not because of the insult, because of what it revealed about his heart. Here was a man who thought his worth, his money, his title gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. And yet, in that moment, I felt more compassion than anger. I thought, how many times have we all been that person so focused on what we think we deserve that we forget who we're called to be? The young flight attendant, Sarah, had been watching from nearby. She came over with that calm, practiced smile that says, "I'm here to help," but I could see the worry in her eyes. She asked the man for his ticket, and he waved her off like she was an inconvenience. "I'm in first class," he said. "That's all that matters." But Sarah, bless her heart, stood firm. "Sir, everyone in first class has an assigned seat," she said politely. "Please show me your boarding pass." He finally handed it over with a sharp flick of the wrist, and when she checked it, her tone stayed steady. "Sir, your seat is 5C. This gentleman has 2A. The man's face turned red, and his voice rose. "I'm not sitting in a middle seat. I'm a platinum member." By now, other passengers were watching. I could feel the tension, the unease, but I stayed calm, peaceful inside, because I knew something he didn't. Your position in life doesn't define your worth, your attitude does. And sometimes God puts you in the middle of someone else's storm, not to fight them, but to remind them that grace always sits higher than pride. As Sarah looked down at that boarding pass, I could see her eyes shift ever so slightly. "Sir," she said calmly, "your seat is actually 5C. You could almost feel the air in that cabin tighten." The man froze for a second, then scoffed as if she'd said something absurd. "That's impossible," he barked. "I booked a window seat. I'm not sitting in a middle seat like some economy passenger." He was loud enough now that heads began to turn, but Sarah, full of grace and professionalism, didn't waver. "I understand, sir," she said gently, "but our records confirm your seat is 5C. This gentleman's ticket is for 2A. For a moment, he just stared at her, face turning red, lips tightening. Then he snapped, "Do you have any idea who I am?" Friends, I've learned that's one of the most dangerous sentences a person can say. The moment we have to remind people of who we are is the moment we've already forgotten the kind of person we're supposed to be. He went on about how much money he spent on flights, about how often he flew, about how he was a platinum elite member who deserved better treatment. And there it was, his worth, tied up in status, in labels, in the illusion that position equals value. But Sarah stayed composed, a picture of poise under pressure. "Sir," she said, "I understand your frustration, but we can't close the doors until everyone is seated correctly." When he refused to move again, that's when the captain stepped out of the cockpit, a tall, steady man with calm authority in his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "we need to resolve this now." "Sir," he addressed the businessman, "you can take your assigned seat, or we'll have to remove you from the flight." You could hear the whispers ripple through the cabin. The man was stunned. "You'd throw me off this plane? Do you know how many flights I take with this airline?" The captain didn't flinch. "Sir, FAA regulations require everyone to sit in their assigned seat. This isn't negotiable. You have 60 seconds to decide." Friends, I'll tell you, pride will take you places grace never can. And right there in front of everyone, that man had a choice to cling to his pride or choose humility. He hesitated, then, with anger boiling beneath the surface, slammed his laptop shut, grabbed his briefcase, and shoved past me hard enough to bump my shoulder. "This isn't over," he muttered, venom in his voice. He dropped into 5C with a scowl so sharp you could feel it from 3 rows away. I quietly took my rightful seat, thanked Sarah for her composure, and smiled at the captain as he nodded and returned to the cockpit. And as the plane began to taxi down the runway, I thought to myself, how often do we fight for the wrong things? Sometimes God will let your seat get challenged just to remind you that peace is worth more than pride. Once the plane was finally in the air and things began to settle, I leaned back in my seat and took a deep breath. There's something about that quiet hum above the clouds that lets you think clearly, lets your spirit reset. Sarah, that young flight attendant who had handled herself with such grace, came by a few minutes later, still a little flustered from all that had happened. She leaned in and said softly, "I'm so sorry about that earlier, sir." I smiled and shook my head. "No need to apologize," I told her. "You handled that perfectly. Calm, respectful, professional. That's exactly the kind of spirit this airline was built on." I could see the relief wash over her face. Sometimes, friends, people just need to be reminded that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, doesn't go unnoticed. We all need someone to tell us. You did well. As the flight went on, I tried to read, tried to focus on my notes, but I kept thinking about that man in 5C. I'd catch a glimpse of him every now and then, still pounding away on his laptop, still radiating frustration, muttering to himself, and deep down I didn't feel anger, I felt compassion. I thought, there's a man who's forgotten what matters. Maybe he's under pressure, maybe he's fighting battles no one else sees, but no matter how successful we become, we never outgrow the need for humility. After the meal service, I pressed the call button and quietly asked Sarah if I could speak with the head attendant and the captain when they had a moment. She nodded, and a few minutes later I was invited to a small area near the cockpit. The head attendant, Michael, greeted me politely, checking my information on his tablet. And then I saw it, the flash of recognition in his eyes. "Oh my goodness," he said softly. "Mr. Eastwood." I smiled and waved it off. "Please, just Clint," I said. "And no apologies. You couldn't have known. Honestly, that's how I prefer it." The captain joined us, a good man, steady, calm, the kind of leader you trust instantly. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked. I nodded. "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to ask about our friend in 5C. Has he filed any complaints?" They exchanged glances, a little uneasy. "Yes," the captain said. "He's already demanded to speak with management when we land." I took a breath and smiled. "Good," I said. "Let's make sure his request is granted. When we arrive in New York, I want you to have him met by airport services and brought to the executive lounge. Tell him senior management wants to meet him personally." They both looked curious, but I could see respect in their eyes. "And one more thing," I added. "Please make sure Sarah is commended for how she handled herself today. She represents the heart of this airline. People like her keep our skies not just safe, but kind." When we landed at JFK, everything moved like clockwork. Passengers gathered their bags, thanked the crew, and hurried off to whatever awaited them in New York. I stayed back just long enough to make sure the plan was in motion. The team had arranged for our friend from 5C to be met by airport services, and from what I heard, he was still fuming, convinced he was heading into a meeting where heads would roll. That's pride for you. It makes you think the world owes you an apology when, in truth, it's your heart that needs one. I arrived at the executive lounge ahead of him, asked the staff to prepare a quiet room, and waited. There's something powerful about silence before a storm. It gives God room to work. About 20 minutes later, I heard the door open, and in walked Marcus Thornton, still in that perfectly tailored suit, still carrying himself like a man who owned the sky. His eyes swept the room, expecting a panel of executives ready to grovel. But when he saw me sitting alone at that table, his confidence cracked just a little. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. "I'm supposed to be meeting with senior management." I smiled and gestured to the seat across from me. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Thornton." He hesitated, confused, then straightened up. "No disrespect, sir, but I'm here to file a complaint." I nodded, stood slowly, and said, "You are, and I'm here to hear it. My name is Clint Eastwood. I'm not just a passenger. I'm the majority owner of this airline." You could almost hear the sound of pride shattering. His mouth opened, then closed again. His briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a thud. Friends, I've seen a lot of expressions in my lifetime: fear, surprise, awe, but that look was something different. It was the face of realization, the face of someone suddenly seeing themselves clearly for the first time. I motioned for him to sit, and in a quiet voice I said, "Mr. Thornton, today you called me an old man. You told me to move to the back of the plane. But more than that, you treated everyone around you, the flight attendants, the captain, the passengers, as if they didn't matter. You thought your position, your money, your success made you more valuable than they were." He tried to speak, but I held up my hand. "I'm not angry," I said, "but I do want you to understand something. None of that, your title, your deals, your wealth, gives you the right to strip others of their dignity. True greatness isn't about how high you fly, it's about how you lift others as you rise." The room went still. I could see it sinking in. Sometimes God lets us fall from our pedestals not to break us, but to humble us, to remind us that respect isn't earned through power, it's given through grace. I looked across the table at Marcus Thornton, and for the first time that day, he wasn't angry, he was quiet. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by something far more honest, shame, maybe even understanding. I leaned forward not to scold him, but to teach him something life had taught me over and over again, that every fall is an invitation to rise a better person. Marcus, I said softly, you made a mistake today. You disrespected people who were only trying to do their jobs. You treated them like they were less than you, and that's not how this airline works, and it's not how life should work. But the good news is, it's never too late to make things right. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the table, and I could see the walls of pride starting to crumble. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. First, Sarah, the flight attendant you dismissed, she's going to receive a commendation and a bonus for her professionalism. She showed grace under pressure, and people like her deserve to be celebrated. The captain and the crew, they'll be recognized too, because they handled themselves with integrity, and that's the kind of spirit we want representing this company. I paused for a moment, then looked him directly in the eyes. As for you, Mr. Thornton, you're going to take some time to think about what happened today. Your platinum status will be suspended for 6 months. During that time, you'll fly like everyone else, no special treatment, no privileges. Maybe it'll remind you that every person on every flight, whether in first class or economy, deserves the same respect. He swallowed hard, clearly humbled, but I wasn't finished. I slid a card across the table. This, I said, is the contact information for our customer relations department. You're going to write personal letters of apology to everyone you disrespected, Sarah, the captain, and the crew. Not the kind written by a lawyer or a PR team. Real letters from the heart, words that show you understand what went wrong and how you plan to do better. He nodded again, barely whispering, I understand. I could see the weight settling on him, but also the spark of something new, awareness, maybe even redemption. I smiled gently. Marcus, you're a talented man, successful, driven, but true success isn't about titles or deals. It's about people. It's about kindness. If you win the whole world but lose your character, what have you really gained? Friends, I've learned that God gives us these moments not to punish us, but to purify us. He'll strip away our pride to show us what truly matters. And that day, in that quiet room at JFK, I saw not a man being condemned, but a man being called higher to humility, to humanity, to grace. Months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, not typed, the kind of letter that carries weight even before you open it. Inside was a message from Marcus Thornton. He began by thanking me, not for sparing him, but for stopping him. He said that day on the plane had been a turning point in his life, that it forced him to see himself in a mirror he'd been avoiding for years. He wrote about how he'd started therapy, how he'd reconnected with his wife and kids, how he'd apologized to his employees for the way he had treated them. He told me he'd begun to run his business differently, listening more, yelling less, replacing fear with encouragement. And as I read those words, I felt that quiet peace that comes when you know God's grace has done its work. You see, friends, sometimes our most embarrassing moments, our most humbling failures, become the very soil where transformation takes root. Marcus said he learned that real leadership isn't about control, it's about compassion. He wrote that he'd stopped measuring success by how many deals he closed and started measuring it by how many lives he uplifted. He ended the letter by saying, Mr. Eastwood, I thought I was flying high that day because of my position, but now I see that true altitude doesn't come from status, it comes from gratitude. Those words touched my heart deeply. It reminded me that God doesn't waste any encounter. Even a confrontation at 30,000 feet can become a divine appointment. I kept that letter, and every now and then, I pull it out as a reminder that people can change, hearts can soften, and pride can turn into purpose when grace steps in. You see, respect isn't something you buy with money or earn with a title. It's something every human being deserves just by being alive. The person serving coffee at the counter, the attendant helping with bags, the stranger sitting next to you in economy, they all matter. You never know what battles they're fighting or what burdens they're carrying. So, treat them with kindness, speak with gentleness, walk with humility. Because at the end of the day, when the titles fade, when the applause stops, and when the bank accounts no longer matter, the only thing that truly remains is how we treated people when we had nothing to gain. That's the legacy that outlives us. That's what God remembers. And friends, that's what I learned that day, that the measure of a person isn't how high they fly, but how deeply they love, how kindly they walk, and how much light they bring into the lives of others.